The countdown is on to Election Day, and all eyes are on Vice President Kamala Harris and former President Donald Trump. Our next guest has been keeping a close eye on the entire race and has his finger on the pulse of young voters. He's the host of Young American with Dylan Douglas on Sirius XM. Dylan Douglas, thank you so much for joining us
Diane,
today.
thank you for having me.
I
Pleasure to be here.
appreciate that. All right, so let's start out. For those people who don't know what the podcast is about,
Sure.
give us a general idea about what it is.
Well, it's Young American. It's about young Americans for young Americans with a focus on Gen Z issues, the issues that inspire so much of my generation. And we have guests of Gen Z people who are real just trailblazers and generational leaders in this generational movement for change in this country.
Okay, and when you think about young Americans,
Sure.
what made you latch on to the topic of politics and Gen Z?
Well, you know, it's funny because right now it's not a very political time. As you know, nothing really is going on in the news. No, I mean, it's election cycle, it's election season. I think it's definitely, I think on either side of the aisle, whichever political persuasion, both believe that this is one of the most fundamental elections in the history of this country. And so many of our issues, our generational issues are up for grabs. Gun control, abortion rights, right? Roe v. Wade being taken away in 2022. Housing, which no one really talks about, which is a huge issue. Right now in America, young Americans, Generation Z, are spending 30% of their income on housing, on
Not
rent,
more.
if not more than any other generation, and any other generation at our age at this time. So it's all these issues that are going to be on the ballot this November. So it's an important time. And my generation, you know, people always ask me, why did I become like political?
Yep.
And I think it was just kind of baked in before I even knew any politics or policy. You know, we're raised, Diana, a certain way to believe certain things through our parents, our teachers, our role models. You know, be nice to others, treat people like you want to be treated. I was instilled with respect for women, you know, as a young man. And quite honestly, we have a candidate running that has respect for none of those things. So even before I was political, I knew with the former president, Donald Trump, that there was something fundamentally wrong with his character, his political persuasion. And my generation, myself, have lived 8 years, almost half my life, under the Trump America. And we're not going back, we're moving forward.
So let me ask you, you mentioned some of the issues that young Americans care about.
Sure.
What strikes you as the number one issue that young Americans care about? Or the top two?
Sure. I mean, I think our issues are just like all Americans' issues. It's housing, it's the economy. As we're now leaving our universities, leaving our high schools and starting like first level jobs, we're realizing that even an entry level job requires like 3 years experience. But then there's some issues, which is insane, correct. But then I think there are some issues that are fundamental to our generation. Abortion for Democrats is a huge issue. And for my generation, I mean, we're all adults here. Late teens, early 20s, those are times when you're sexually active, you know, you're dating around. And so sexual health, Planned Parenthood is very important to my generation. Not to mention that we grew up in a Roe v. Wade world, and now that right's been taken away, so we don't know anything else. And we're very, very passionate about bringing Roe into the center focus this November, making it a Roe-vember election, and bringing that back.
What do you notice in terms of, I can see obviously your persuasion, what do you notice about Gen Z's leaning when it comes to the two candidates?
Well, I mean, a lot of people talk about it. It's a gender election, particularly when it comes to my generation. On the whole, Gen Z, which is roughly like 1997 to 2010, that's the area, vote left of center.
Okay.
And this election, 41 million members of my generation are eligible to vote, including 8.5 million first-time voters. And of that generation, we vote just left of center. But if you break that down by gender, women, 60-70% are going to be voting for Kamala Harris this cycle for my generation. With men, it's going to be 60% that could be voting for Donald Trump. So it's a huge gender divide, which can be very interesting to see how it plays out this November.
When you think about the issues that younger Americans care about, especially what you brought up, there were recent stats that shows then that you know, no matter the age, those are the top issues:
Sure.
economy, housing, jobs, and women's rights, right? But there is a divide between, you know, who they prefer, an older American,
Sure.
right? What do you think older Americans can learn from Gen Z when it comes to politics and, what they want to see accomplished?
Well, I mean, I'm one of those people. I'm not really like a boomer hater. I think each generation's had generational struggles. You go back to those like baby boomers, the Vietnam protests, right? Civil rights. Those are fundamental times. Then there was other movements all the way up into the present. So every generation's had struggles. Mm-hmm. But I think what they can learn from us is that I see a lot of flack from our generation that we're weak and we're whiners and we're the right will call us like snowflakes. Mm-hmm. And that's just not the case. I mean, just look at what we've been through. I was born a year before September 11th, 9/11. Mm-hmm. I was in the city when that fateful day happened. Mm-hmm. We're speaking here at the New York Stock Exchange.
Down the street.
Yeah, right. This is a revered place. It's also sort of infamous. Mm-hmm. I vaguely remember in 2008 the financial crisis. Mm-hmm. I remember the Occupy Wall Street protests here. 2 of my 4 years of university were taken from a pandemic where I was stuck at home. The most fun years of your life taken as we had a president at the time that said it would just go away and refused to wear a mask. So there's been a lot of issues, not to mention gun violence, right? The first generation to grow up being acutely aware that we could be murdered in our own classrooms, having teachers teaching us shooting drills, telling us that the best thing to do in an active shooter situation is to play dead. That has an effect on us, and it can make our generation really, really angry, really, really pessimistic, and scared for our future. And some of us are, but I think a lot of us are optimistic and are excited to do the hard work to push the ball forward, to make tomorrow a better place for everyone, all generations.
So I want to ask you, your generation is known for doing a lot on social media.
Sure.
Some may call it the TikTok generation. How has your generation been utilizing social media as it pertains to this election?
Well, it's a huge, huge, huge tool. And so many of the guests that I have on my show, Young American, that airs every Saturday at 11 on SiriusXM Progress, I have a lot of these political influencers. But the key to the people I have on my show is that there's a difference between political activism and civic engagement. Okay. And I always say that our generation is the most politically active. We're always posting the infographic. We're showing up to the rally, showing up to the protest, but least civically engaged. And I think it's not necessarily our fault, but not being educated in our civic process. Our generation, when it comes even to voting, it's actually sort of wishy-washy on our voter registration. This cycle, it's going to be high, but in other cycles, it's been less than high. So I would say that just kind of threading the needle from using social media as the great tool it is to amplify, but backing that up with actual civic engagement.
Yeah, because that's happened in previous generations as well. Typically when individuals are on the younger end of just life, they will speak about it, but not do the actual action that is necessary. So people do need to remember to go vote if they want their voice actually heard. So you mentioned, your podcast, obviously, and it's on Saturdays. But tell us about some of the favorite guests that you've had and some topics that you tackled that really resonated.
Deja Fox, who's an abortion rights activist out of Arizona, she was my first guest. She's a real generational leader. You're going to hear a lot from her going forward. She was the first actual, to your point, political influencer to speak at any party convention. She spoke at the Democratic convention in August. And she's great. We've had Senator Ed Markey, writer of the Green New Deal. He's been on the show. And so many other phenomenal guests, all of which, to your point, have like public personas, post and use social media as such a great tool, but then back it up with real engagement. This girl, Olivia Juliana, who got into a fight on Twitter with Matt Gaetz, who's this conservative congressman from Florida, and he was attacking her on her just appearance, her body, which was just horrific stuff. And she could have cried about it, but she didn't, and she was able, from that experience, to in 4 days raise $2 million for abortion care and Planned Parenthood, which is huge. I mean, $2 million in 2 days is like the best day for any presidential campaign. And this girl, just from her phone, raised that for a good cause. So it's amazing stuff. And going back to your question just about what older people can learn from us, the truth is, Diane, we're young. We're at the start of our life, so we do not know
You
the
are.
answers. I'm at the start of our life. Our generation
I'm in the
is.
middle.
No. But our generation is really at the start of our life, so we don't have any of the answers. In fact, a lot of time we're asking for the answers. We're asking for the solutions. And if it's something like climate that we're so passionate, we're passionate not because just we care about the environment, we do, but because the environment, our planet, we have the most in stake in it, right? I mean, knock on wood, we're going to be here we still have 60, 70, 80% of our life on this planet left to live. So, of course, we're going to be more invested in those issues.
Do you ever have guests who disagree with your point of view, and what do you say to them?
I listen to them. You know, Diane, I think a big problem, and particularly our generation sort of stereotyped, is that we're very strong in our convictions, maybe possibly to the point of disregard for other points of views or political persuasions. And I'm open to all thinking, because I believe that especially in this United States, we're all Americans, and we all want the same thing, which is a better country. And we just have different ways of articulating that and thinking about it. So I'm open to all persuasions.
And I want to ask you, before you got into podcasting,
Sure.
obviously podcasting requires some hosting abilities. And, you know, I know your parents are not hosts per se, but I'm sure they, you know, had some advice for you. And your dad, as you know, Michael Douglas, is pretty, well, as you probably know, is pretty revered down here, especially for the character he played in Wall Street. Did they give you any
revered
tips?
Depending on who you ask.
Okay, that's fair.
But sure.
Did they give you any tips before you were starting your podcast?
No, they believe in me. They're so supportive, and they let me rip. You know, it's a little different from acting, politics, and all that stuff. But they're very, very supportive. And like I said before I knew
politics is very different from acting, but the host.
Yeah. In fact, politicians are some of the best actors. I've started to learn that. Yeah, but I hear your point. But no, like I said before, I think not that they necessarily instilled in me politics, but before I was even political, you're brought up, raised with certain value systems, right? A certain moral compass. And I think all of that's from my parents, and all of that's played a huge part in how I look at the world and my place in it.
All right. Thank you, Dylan.
Diane, thank you so much. Real pleasure.
It. All right. Our thanks to Dylan Douglas. His podcast, Young American with Dylan Douglas, airs Saturdays on Sirius XM. Make sure to check it out.